Thanks very much, Daniel, and thanks for having me here today. I am an attorney here in the United States, and as Daniel mentioned, I'm going to start with our legal framework here in the United States, which I think is um, part of the challenges for cities in managing protests, especially protests where there are groups that are looking perhaps to engage in conflict. In the US, our Constitution protects the right to protest peaceably. That includes the freedom of speech and the freedom of assembly. Those have been interpreted to mean that our government cannot, state or local government included, cannot ban hate speech or other provocative speech. They can ban and criminalize imminent incitements to violence, but that's a pretty high bar under US law. And so a corollary of that is that governments also cannot impose the greater cost of security on those groups that need more police force to ensure public safety because of their provocative message. And the second piece of this is guns are a huge part of for some of the culture for some in the United States. Our Second Amendment protects the right to bear arms for personal self-defense, but U.S. gun laws really extend beyond that protection to include, in many states, even protecting the open carrying of semi-automatic weapons. So this gets to the point that in many places, officials can ban, as part of protest regulations, items that can be used as weapons, like bats or shields or even flagpoles holding up signs, but they cannot ban guns themselves. There's also a misunderstanding, especially among law enforcement in the US, that people have a right to act as private militia groups. So basically their own private armies come together with these kinds of large weapons and act in a coordinated way, often wearing military style uniforms. And the law enforcement often believe there's nothing they can do to stop this. So in reality, laws in every state actually bar this kind of private militia activity, but they're relatively unknown and definitely under-enforced. So then you take that constitutional framework, sort of the limitations on what government can do in this polarized environment, and then we've seen over the past year sort of two types of protest activity that have been of concern in terms of the violence that has resulted from them. The first are protests by usually far-right groups that mix threats of violence, often in the form of militia activity, with legitimate protest activity. These have usually been around the 2020 presidential election, both leading up to the election and then even more so after now former President Donald Trump lost, events called like Stop the Steal or anti-voter fraud protests. We've also seen these around public health measures relating to COVID that definitely sort of mix conspiracy theories in there about the need for public health measures. But I think the prime example we have in the US of this is the January 6th insurrection at the US Capitol. And as I sort of just mentioned, one of the big issues, one of the big drivers of the violence at these events is you have these private militia groups and other armed individuals mixing with conspiracy theorists and white supremacist groups and other narratives that are often driven by misinformation online that has been amplified and given credibility by elected officials who see it to their political advantage. Then you also mix in a large number of people who may, in good faith, be coming to protest and believe the information they've seen, do not intend to engage in violence, but you have mass crowds at that point that make it much harder for law enforcement to deal with the situation. And the second category of protests are racial justice protests that we saw a lot of last summer. There are conflicts between protesters and counter-protesters, also again often driven by misinformation online, when militia groups will come to protect private property or assist law enforcement against threats by Antifa, which are a left-wing group that it would be a false threat online that Antifa was coming to destroy businesses. So the result of these things has been violence. It's difficult for law enforcement to control these events when people are armed. Law enforcement has often been caught unprepared by not really understanding the threat, not working with the community. And when they do manage to manage the situation, it's often through very expensive measures that, again, they cannot impose on the protest groups themselves, separating them, limiting weapons, imposing checkpoints. And so it's a complex situation that really screams for a help to an end to the extreme polarization we're seeing.